Okay, good afternoon. This is the Capital Research Center's Ask Me Anything panel, where we invite you to stump the experts. This is also going to serve as CRC's InfluenceWatch podcast for the week. Our InfluenceWatch podcast actually airs every Thursday at 10 a.m. You can subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or any other podcast service that you use, or you can catch it live on Facebook or YouTube every Thursday at 10 a.m. This also highlights our InfluenceWatch website, which we just launched in August of 2017. InfluenceWatch is designed to be a wiki-style encyclopedia of all of the influencers, whether it's the organizations, foundations, PACs, legislative agencies, individuals, activists, the entire activist community. We are trying to connect the dots on our website. Our website is really designed to be very precise, fact-checked, very balanced in its presentation of information, so that the information is just overwhelming when you look at who the organizations are and what the connections might be. The individuals who are going to be on our stage are certainly Dr. Allen, who many of you just heard. He is our Chief Investigative Officer. Scott Walter is our president. He served in the Bush administration. He's been our president since 2016, and he also served at Philanthropy Roundtable. Mike Watson is the managing editor of the InfluenceWatch website, and he has served as our research director and previously was researching at a public affairs firm. Matthew Vadum is another one of our senior researchers. He has been at CRC for 10 years, and he is the author of Subversion, Inc., which exposed the Acorn Network. So all of these individuals are well equipped to handle these questions, so please feel free to ask them anything. Oh, and one thing I will say, and Scott, you may want to echo this, we are really focused on the connections, so we're not, the person who wins the iPad isn't going to be the person who asks if George Soros dyes his hair, and we don't know that answer. This is going to be more about the substance of the connections between and among the organizations. So if you know something that we don't, that's what we will reward. So thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Kristen, and welcome to this week's podcast for the InfluenceWatch website. Mike Watson and I are the ones usually on that, but we're joined, as Kristen said, by more colleagues from the Capital Research Center here. And we are happy to take questions on any part of the webs of the left, or on how the various donor entities operate and the rest. And I think to start things off, I'm going to ask my colleague Mike Watson to review one of his favorite stories that we've covered, and then we'll start taking questions.
So, is anyone here from New York City? One. So the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, is obviously a fairly left-wing Democrat. His political consultancy, or it's not his consultancy, but his communications consultants, Berlin Rosen, also the communications consultants for New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman. In late 2016, they had a very interesting client, the Jill Stein campaign. The Green Party's, we may all remember, shortly after it turned out that Donald Trump had won the Electoral College by winning very narrow margins in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, the Green Party launched a series of recount efforts, independently funded, because although it was close, it was within 1%, I think, in all 3 states. It was not close enough for an automatic recount. And somebody obviously had to handle the communications for that, and Jill Stein turned to Bill de Blasio's consultants, who were paid, I believe the total was something in the order of $250,000, to handle the communications and the press for those recounts, which I believe one was dismissed dismissed from even before it happened. One upheld the result, and the other just never went forward. I believe that to be the case.
Thanks. If folks want to ask questions, we have the 2 microphones, and you're also welcome to ask Steve questions if there's things left over from all the fun fusion and the rest. Yes, sir.
Hi. What's the current status of the potential release of Lois Lerner's closed-door testimony? If we know.
Yes. Does anybody know?
Do not.
Yeah, I haven't heard more on that. I will say that it's an instance though where I would blame 2 folks for how little proper investigations was ever done on that story. Our friends at the Media Research Center, shortly before the 2016 election, went and calculated how long it had been since any major television news network had mentioned the Lois Lerner IRS scandal, and the record was 640 some days. That was the most of any of them, and one of them had been a mere 450 or so days since a mentioning of that. But of course, the Republicans in Congress also deserve credit because they had done nothing to have it enter into the news for more than a year. And then, looking quite foolish, I think it was just weeks before the election, right? They did a touch of saber rattling about the Lois Lerner scandal. And this is particularly egregious because in the Nixon impeachment articles, which never quite got voted on because he resigned the night before the actual first impeachment vote would have been held, but in the impeachment papers that would have passed the House against him the next day, one of the main articles was precisely abuse of the IRS. So the idea that we shouldn't be concerned about the kind of abuse that was done there is egregious. And I'll apologize, but this is a hobby horse of mine too, is that in the case of the IRS, there were something like 300 groups that were suppressed in the 2012 election cycle. That was the whole point of that. It was in the lead up to the 2012 presidential election, the IRS was suppressing the tax-exempt status granting for these. But it wasn't the usual tax-exempt that you think of, the 501c3, like your local women's shelter or the YWCA or whatnot. All but one of those hundreds of conservative groups were 501c4s. They were trying to be 501c4s, which is a different part of the tax-exempt code that's designed for things like voter registration and get out the vote and issue ads in campaigns. So the right-wingers were trying to do C4s. In the left's case, they use the C3s for voter registration and get out the vote because there's a loophole. You're allowed to use C3 foundation money and C3 charitable groups money to do those highly political things as long as you do it on a nonpartisan basis. Now, that, of course, in this town is laughable. You will not find a single person willing to swear to you that there is a C3 group somewhere that does voter registration and get out the vote on a nonpartisan basis. So,
and it's actually worse with regard to Nixon because I believe that was for an attempt Nixon was making to use the IRS to go after his political enemies, and the people at the IRS had actually refused to do that. And yet that was an article of impeachment and was described as the article that was most likely to pass and remove him from office. So and there's a pattern of abusing the IRS. If you go back to the 90s, what the Clintons would do is that they would have questions raised in articles from friendly reporters. Remember, Sidney Blumenthal himself was a New Yorker writer and worked for other media organizations. And they would have their own people plant these stories. Then the IRS would turn around and use these stories as the basis for opening investigations. So Heritage Foundation and Cato and any group that was conservative or libertarian would get targeted, and the people at the IRS would just say, well, we're just going by what's in the media, you know. I mean, if these questions are raised, we have to investigate them. But of course, the media would not raise questions for groups that were on the other side. And then I had my personal experience. I was involved with Newt Gingrich during this IRS case that I mentioned, and there was actually an IRS report that cleared him, And the Clinton administration, the White House, ordered the IRS people to sit on it. And finally, someone leaked it, and we were able to get it out, and it was cleared. But for that, the idea was to just let it hang over him that he was under investigation, and he would forever be under investigation.
Yes, actually, I have to give my favorite quick. Oh, you have a question? Okay. Well, you go ahead. I'll tell my other IRS story in a minute.
I basically want to go back to where we were with the FBI and the collusion and the corruption with McAuliffe. I am from Virginia, and I have a dog in that fight, and have really studied this. In 2014, the FBI came out with a statement on public corruption for Virginia. All of it was to go to a special group. I've learned since then they did it in a couple of different states. The different things that have been left out of the media is basically right now McAuliffe has 32 Chinese nationals in Fairfax County, not in federal court, suing him for the $500,000 they put into that EB-5 program.
Right.
And
The visa for sale program.
Visa for Sale project, yes. And they waited. It's been 5 years. They never sold any cars. They have the 25 cars they had come up with. There are several other of the people who had put up more than $500,000. It's just 32 of them. And it kind of ties in with Wang, who had given him $130,000 earlier. But in 2014, when the FBI took all that over, we had several incidences in Virginia. Number one was Democratic fundraiser, Michael Gardner. Michael Gardner molested several young girls. Michael Gardner was found guilty in court. Michael Gardner, the appeals court said, no, you don't get to go out. Our Supreme Court, Cynthia Kinzer, not only let him out, he then turned around and tried to hire a hitman to kill the young girls, which is a pattern and practice in Virginia. And so what happened was the FBI very quietly went in and had a private meeting with the Virginia Legislature Courts of Justice and Cynthia Kinzer. And what happened was Cynthia Kinzer all of a sudden just retired. News media, everyone said, oh, it just got to be a lot for her. She is now the ethics counsel for our Supreme Court and is also a very active attorney. But it doesn't stop there. The corruption starts at the Richmond School of Law. At the same time that James Comey, Tim Kaine, from what I can tell, were adjunct professors. Adjunct professors usually, from what I've been told, make 5, 10, 15,000 maybe. They made 35 to 50,000 per one article I was able to dig up. So basically, all of our Virginia State Bar ethics people and whatnot are all hired as adjunct professors at the Richmond School. The accolades that James Comey was given was, there's been 2 that I've, since 2014. One was a special degree and another one was to speak at the commencement service. And it goes deeper and deeper. Our FBI, one of the agents that's was supposed to investigate my stuff, I have on tape stating very clearly, they took it over in the FBI in DC. They're not allowed to investigate anything. So when you say the FBI, the 7th floor, has nothing to do with the rank and file, it's totally untrue. The rank and file are following the instructions throughout all of this. And that's just a few things that I've got. I mean, when you look at what Eric Holder did, $251 billion in our mortgages, he walks out the door. He negotiated all that with Covington and Burlington, where he walked into his 11th floor office and was given a $78 million check. You know, and
well, as a Loudoun County resident in Virginia, the hillbillies, right? We are
Ignorant hillbillies.
Ignorant as an ignorant.
Although
hillbilly.
he misspelled hillbillies. I mean, if you're going to say somebody is an ignorant hillbilly, you should at least spell it right. So,
yes. Well, as an ignorant hillbilly in Loudoun County, I appreciate your watchdogging all this stuff. It's hard to believe that in a state controlled by Terry McAuliffe there could be anything shady, but perhaps there's something to that. Thanks so much. I want to call on Matthew Vadum at this point for something that we often get asked about, which is it possible to trace money to Antifa? And the simple answer is it isn't easy to trace, and it isn't clear that they need much money. But groups that are at least in the fringes, near in the general neighborhood of Antifa, do seem to have somebody that's able to assist them. Matthew, if you want to tell a little of that story.
Right, so we're talking about the concept of fiscal sponsorship here, and that's where an ad hoc or an unincorporated, excuse me, activist group can take donations that the donor can deduct from his income taxes by funneling the money through an established 501c3 nonprofit corporation. And so this is called fiscal sponsorship, and then the C3 will take a few points. We'll take some juice, the VIG from it, a premium, and that way you can deduct the money from your income tax if you're donating to the group. So what happened?
Or if you're a foundation that has to give to a 501c3 charity, it's kosher.
Sure.
And if I may interject one thing, the IRS rules governing fiscal sponsorship are fairly clear that you can only fiscally sponsor an organization. Like, if CRC were to fiscally sponsor a project, it would have to be in line with our mission. So it's not like you can just have a fiscal sponsoring entity that fiscal sponsors everything. If you fiscally sponsor something, you are tacitly saying you agree with it. You are tacitly saying that you are fairly explicitly saying that you support them.
Okay, so with Antifa, it's almost impossible to find out who's actually funding them, but you can get to the emanations and penumbras of it by looking at organizations that are related to Antifa. So you look at, there's a group fairly obscure called the Alliance for Global Justice, which serves as a fiscal sponsor for an actual Antifa group, Refuse Fascism. And so you can give money to Alliance for Global Justice earmarked for Refuse Fascism, and then you can deduct it from your taxes, and then Refuse Fascism will beat you up at a rally if they don't recognize you as a donor, presumably, set fire to your car, and smash up your bank's windows or whatever it is that these Antifa people do. So that is the Soros connection, is that Soros has given some money through his Open Society Foundations to the Alliance for Global Justice. So what we have here is a meeting of the minds. They're the same, they're moving in the same direction, or Soros wouldn't have given them money. He embraces their radicalism, but not openly in public, their radical tactics. And so that's what we've been investigating, and it's pretty slow going, but with luck, we will turn up more in the future as more groups get created and have to file their IRS Form 990s, their annual report. It's like an informational return that they have to file with the IRS every year. But when you start a new organization, there's a bit of a lag before it starts to show up in repositories of information like GuideStar or on Nexus or what have you. So, short answer is no, we don't know where Antifa money comes from, but we're looking really hard.
And if I may interject briefly on Alliance for Global Justice in a broader sense, you can go to our websites, InfluenceWatch.org and CapitalResearch.org. We have written up on the organization. Even if you look beyond the possible connections to Antifa, these guys are backers of communist regimes in Latin America. They collect money for the legal defense funds for cop killers. They're the extreme left. And they are not the Democratic, the Democratic Party. They are the extreme left in the United States.
Yes. Do you have a question?
Yeah, hi. I have a question about David Brock, who is involved in a lot of different groups, and I understand he's connected to at least probably 3 or 4 different major organizations on the left. So if you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I'm going to ask Mike, who knows a great deal about one of the parts of the Brocktopus, which is the David Brock empire of groups, crew especially.
Yeah, so Brock is a former conservative, now liberal. Liberal is maybe giving him a little bit too much credit. Close alignment with the Clinton family, who ran a number of the Clinton supporting super PACs in the 2016 election, and he still runs a couple of liberal organizations. Until very recently, he was chair of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, which is a long-standing...
Or crew.
Crew, yeah. Crew is its acronym name. A long-standing liberal, legal, and ostensibly ethics group. Spent most of the Bush years going after Bush administration figures, former House Republican leader Tom DeLay. Obviously, since 2017, has spent most of its time going after the Trump administration. However, in the early Obama years, when there were no Republicans in Washington worth going after because they had no power, because they had lost the 2008 election, the crew made a curious decision. This was before Brock gets involved. Crew makes a curious decision. The liberals, the Obama administration, were trying to increase regulations on for-profit secondary education, for-profit universities. Kaplan, University of Phoenix, those are the two big ones. And Crew came out very hostile to one of the leading advocates for increasing these regulations on these for-profit universities. And this actually raised the suspicions of the left. Mike Elk, who is a highly controversial labor union activist and reporter, was kind of the first guy to look around and say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. Why are these liberals opposing this Obama administration initiative that had been fairly popular amongst liberals? And he suspected that they were taking money from someone connected to for-profit universities. Many, many years later, we find out that using a cutout political consultancy in Sacramento, foundations connected to John Sperling, who is the former, at the time he was, the head of University of Phoenix, were using these nonprofits connected to the Sacramento political consultancy to run money into a number of organizations. Most prominent was Crew, that then created this sort of liberal opposition to this Obama administration rule, which would have hurt University of Phoenix. It's a classic example of what you might call pay to play. You're advocating against what you would think would be your ideological interest.
Yep. Oh, yes, sir.
So I think that the woman in the back, that was a fantastic, I think that she should win an iPad. But I just wanted to come up because I'm a student. Okay, you had a very, very interesting. So I'm a student. I'm here from West Michigan, from Calvin College, so long trip all the way here. And West Michigan is one of the reasons that Trump may have won the election, granted. I'm from Illinois originally, so I was the youngest, one of the youngest elected conservative Republicans in any forum in the state of Illinois. So for a lot of my time in politics in Illinois, for about a year during the campaign, I was fighting Mike Madigan, who is from the precinct right around Midway Airport, controlling my state, controlling my city very deeply. I don't know. I'm sure you might already understand
The
his
blog
scheme.
Red Racing Horses, which I recommend that you read, refers to him as the state dictator, with
Absolutely.
dictator hyphened out.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you might already know his scheme, but to maybe fill in everybody else, being that he is the Speaker of the House and he has a lot of power over what I believe is the county property assessor, the assessors of the however much money the buildings are worth, basically, the property assessments. And so he puts all of his cronies inside this department, and then he goes and assesses, say, the Willis Tower from a foreign investor who buys the building or any of one of the other buildings. They're mostly now purchased by Japanese and South Korean and Chinese investors. And he will say that, oh no, these buildings are worth 6 times more than they're worth. Or he'll even go the other way around. And then he'll go to his private firm, his law firm, and he will fight against his own cronies to either lower or raise the property value, and then he'll take a cut of that. He'll take about 10 to 30% of that cut, and he'll just take that and put that in his own pocket. And unfortunately, that's completely legal under the current way that that's all set up. And I'm sure you might already know that, but I kind of fill in that for everybody else. And I figured, well, as a student, maybe I'd try to win an iPad.
Well, I appreciate it, and if you go to capitalresearch.org and search for Madigan, you'll find some pieces connected to him, including this quotation, which, to do him his justice, he was described as, quote, more Machiavellian than Machiavelli by incarcerated former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich. So when you earn Rod Blagojevich's respect in that way, you really earned respect. Steve, another thing that's fun to oh, I'm sorry, we got another question, sorry, go ahead.
My name is Matthew Middleton. I'm a recent graduate from American University here in DC. And with all the focus that we put on George Soros and the partnerships that he funds, who are some other big funders that we should be watching moving into 2018 and 2019?
Well, who wants to do Steyer? Mike?
Steve can do Steyer. I'll do others.
Well, Tom Steyer is the person who wants to run for president. He is the main funder of the environmentalist organizations on the left. Obviously, global warming is his big cause, or climate change, they would say now. And he was deeply involved. I mean, we were talking before about Terry McAuliffe, and it just shows you that he's pretty much everywhere, because that became a big issue in Terry McAuliffe's race in 2013.
For governor of Virginia.
For governor of Virginia. That you had Ken Cuccinelli, who was the Republican candidate, who had gone after a guy named Michael Mann, who's a famous environmentalist professor who had been exposed in some leaked emails that showed that they had various things had been rigged. There's the famous hockey stick that supposedly shows the dramatic increase in global temperatures that is not valid scientifically, and yet this fellow had made a lot of it. And so Cuccinelli had gone after him because he had been at the, University of Virginia, and this became then a cause for the left, and so they came in tremendous support. Mann actually campaigned with McAuliffe, and Steyer sort of saw that. Virginia is, in some ways, it's a laboratory or a training ground for a lot of what happens, because it has its off-year elections, and so you have a few states like Kentucky and New Jersey that have
Off year.
Off year or off year, even better.
2013, for instance.
Yeah, and so if you don't have much, then that's a good way for your people to go, and they can train in that election. In 2013, it'd be Virginia or New Jersey would be the big elections in that year. In fact, when they used to have the big political conventions, they had the largest political conventions ever held in democracy anywhere in the state of Virginia for the Democrats and the Republicans, and all the people who ran the national Democratic and Republican conventions would come and train at those in Virginia. So anyway, so Virginia becomes this big laboratory, and they were really trying out a lot of the techniques in terms of direct mail, in terms of being able to communicate with the people. Obviously, the big thing now is social media and the internet that we're just sort of now trying to figure out how to use. And we're in the early stages, even though people have been using email for politics for more than 20 years. But the effort to use artificial intelligence to find out the people that would be your supporters. So anyway, so this is the kind of thing. Steyer is, in particular because of his Silicon Valley connections, is quite dangerous in that regard, and being able to tap into that. And as I've said, one of the great things that we're facing as a threat in our society is lion algorithms. In other words, computer, in effect, really complicated formulas that decide a lot of things, like they're using now with Facebook to decide which sites to censor based on the words that are used, which if you rig the algorithm, you can get the results that you want, and nobody can really see inside the algorithm except a very, very few people. And that allows you, you could have like government hiring, for example, where people's qualifications judged based on an algorithm, and you rig it, but no one would be able to know. So this is the kind of thing where, being able to tap into Silicon Valley, that brain trust is really important.
And money.
And he sort of brings that in there as well.
Yeah, and Steyer has been seen in Iowa, not previously noted for its high-tech industry. So I just make that observation. Mike, you have more?
Yeah, so, and I mean, it's easy to focus on like people like Steyer and Soros who play in the partisan electoral game. Steyer, I believe, for the past 2 cycles has been the top single contributor to super PACs and to political candidates. However, there are also the long-term institutions, the foundations. 501c3 foundations obviously are forbidden from engaging in direct electioneering, vote for X, support. There are limited things that they can fund that say support policy Y. Some of the big foundations, some of them don't have like a name attached. Ford Foundation has existed for over 100 years.
Well, just short of 100.
Just short of 100 years. They are, I believe they're in the billions in their assets.
Over 10.
They give hundreds of millions in grants per year. A lot of it going to groups that support the labor union agenda, that support environmentalism, that support the pro-choice movement. On the pro-choice movement, you have Warren Buffett. His foundation that he named after his late wife, Susan Thompson Buffett, is one of, if not the largest private funder of abortion rights and contraceptive development in the world.
Yep. Bloomberg.
And then also Mike Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, is the leading funder of the gun control movement.
In my experience, in years and years of studying the left, I have never found a left-wing group of any significance that did not receive money from Ford and Soros's foundations. It's almost unheard of.
And I should just add, Bloomberg's group was in the news recently. Every town for gun safety. Of course, liberals don't care about gun safety. They just want to ban guns, and that's their version of safety. They put out the lie that there were 18 school shootings so far this year. They counted somebody, I think, committed to suicide or like fired off a gun on school property late at night when nobody was there. They've included all these, accidental discharges.
The statistic was so misleading that the Washington Post criticized it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's got to, so that's got to be, significant.
And yet I saw it in the lead sentence to an episode of NBC Nightly News one night. That figure made it into that.
Careful fact check. Well, if you like, you can talk to us about how careful the fact checkers of America are, Steve.
Well, I love looking at fact checkers because, of course, they were set up that there's this idea of the gateway that our problem in our society is we don't have the folks who are deciding who is telling the truth and who isn't, like we used to at some point, supposedly. And that was really true. When you had 3 TV networks, for example, had 3 news departments, then it was easier for Walter Cronkite, and if you had 3 anchors who were of your political persuasion, you could pretty well control what people hear. And that would be true today. If you just watched NBC, CBS, and ABC, you would get a very tilted view of things. I remember that, and I like to point out that there were 18 months when Brian Williams was the anchor at NBC and Dan Rather was the anchor at CBS, which means 2 of the 3 anchors who were on the 3 networks during that period ended up being fired for being pathological liars, and that's kind of what you see with regard to the idea of I think that the people who want to be fact checkers tend to be people who are authoritarian in mindset, and what they do is they criminalize, as they see it, opinion. So if you say that you think chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream, they'll do a fact check column, and the point will be that you get 4 pants on fires or 4 Pinocchios or whatever it is for saying that this is your favorite kind of ice cream.
Or if you question how many scoops of ice cream
Yes.
Donald Trump insists on when dining with other people.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Is it 1 or is it 2?
Yeah, and one of my favorite examples of this is from this last campaign, because Donald Trump said that, in his opinion, Hillary Clinton's immigration policies indicated that she was for open borders. In other words, for basically not having any restrictions on immigration. And this was written up, and all the fact checkers, and I have a column on this on our website, written up by, I think, every single one of the fact checkers, PolitiFact and so on, factcheck.org, was written by every one of them as a lie on the part of Donald Trump. And so I write my piece, I'm starting to write my piece, and I'm like, wait a minute, how can an opinion be a lie? Now, if it has no rational basis at all, the moon is made of green cheese or something like that, then I guess you could say that maybe that's a lie. But a reasonable person could look at Hillary's policies and come to the conclusion that she was for open borders. And then what happened? We had WikiLeaks. And what's in WikiLeaks? Hillary Clinton gives a $225,000 speech to Brazilian bankers. And what does she say in there? That she's for open borders, that is her dream. So then you go back and look at these pieces by the fact checkers, and they're all about how Donald Trump is a liar for saying something that, A, is opinion, and, subject to, you can't say the person's lying for having an opinion you don't like. But then it turns out that it's just factually wrong, because we have Hillary saying herself that she was for open borders, that those were her dream. And you see this pattern every time. Donald Trump said that, he said something like Hillary Clinton's folks gave $675,000 to Jill McCabe. If you were here for the session earlier, we were talking about the woman that ran for the state senate in Virginia, was married to the FBI official. And Trump says this, and this is written up as pants on fire. And I'm trying to figure out, well, how is this that they're writing it up? And they say, well, okay, Terry McAuliffe, yeah, he gave her this money, and it was from his PAC, and it was from Democratic Party funds that he controlled. But gosh, he also gave money to these other state senate candidates that were running. And he gave money to these other people who were running for other things. And so how in the world could Trump be implying that there's something wrong with it? There was nothing factually wrong in what he said. Now, you maybe could argue that he wasn't clear that it wasn't Hillary Clinton personally, but that's not what they attacked him for. They didn't say, well, you said Hillary Clinton, and what you meant was Hillary Clinton's organization. They didn't attack him for that. They just came up with these things from out of nowhere that were, I guess, an argument that maybe it's not fair to criticize somebody for that, but it's not an argument as to whether it's true or not. So these journalists who were gatekeepers don't seem to really understand, the idea of objective fact.
Yes, sir. Yes, please. So it'll be on the podcast.
Hi. So my name is Mike Stark. I work for American Bridge, David Brock's Democratic Super PAC. Now, I want to know if you folks really believe the left pays to bus voters into polls that they're not allowed to vote at, if they really pay the protesters that are out in the streets, do you believe that there's that much money? And I also wanted to ask you, I know Donors Trust obscures a lot of source money on the right. Do you know of any mechanism by which the left uses to disguise where its money is coming from?
Oh, that's really easy, sure. Be happy to tell you. I suggest you go to capitalresearch.org or InfluenceWatch and you look up the Tides Foundation. Tides Foundation far predates Donors Trust, and it functions in precisely the same way that Donors Trust does. The very first grant that it ever, the very first reason that it was brought into existence was because there was a couple who wished to make a grant to a left-wing environmentalist group. And now, of course, that's an easy thing to do. All you have to do is simply write a check and hand it over to a group. But in this case, they decided, well, they didn't really want to do that. And so they created the Tides Foundation. Sir, are you unfamiliar with the Tides Foundation? There's been quite a bit written about it.
I mostly am because, like I said, I'm a Democrat, and I'm much more familiar with Donors Trust and the right-wing money laundering.
Well, would you care to take a guess which organization's larger by many tens of millions of dollars?
Do you know for sure?
Oh, I know for absolutely for
This
sure.
is publicly available information.
This is publicly available information. It's a shame you haven't gone to InfluenceWatch.org and capitalresearch.org, and it's a shame not to be better informed. Because the answer is it's very easy. By the tens of millions of dollars per year, the Tides Foundation is larger. And that, of course, is just one instance of such a thing. Now, we have no idea that both Tides and Donors Trust are dwarfed by groups like Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund and Vanguard and Charles Schwab. Those are all just sort of generic commercial entities that do the exact same thing because, of course, there's nothing illegal about it whatsoever. And they do the exact same thing, and no one knows how much of the money that goes through those far larger groups is done to keep it from being easily traceable. But I would suspect that it actually is considerably more, because if I were a super nervous donor on the left or right, I would much rather go through something like Fidelity, where nobody would begin to be able to figure it out, than through those.
So I'm glad to have teed up that softball for you. But you answered the first two questions too about, do any of you really believe that Democrats bus voters into communities they're not allowed to vote in to engage in voter fraud?
Well, I have a
Well,
question
Scott Fulval said they do, and that they've been doing it for a long time, and he was caught on Project Veritas undercover video saying that. And that was the sting operation that also included Robert Creamer, where he said very clearly that Hillary Clinton was in on this plot to send people to Trump rallies to try to start rumbles, to try to start fistfights.
Now,
So,
it's my turn to correct the record. That's not what anything was said. It was a hypothetical.
no, it was no. Well, then you're factually you're wrong.
Well,
but
and in any event, there's an easy thing, sir, and that is
that example, I believe.
Yeah, the James O'Keefe of Project Veritas is probably here. So if you want an answer about his tapes, then you're welcome to go talk to James O'Keefe about his tapes. But is it tomorrow? But the But what I can, that isn't what I was talking about earlier. To me, it's a far greater scandal when you have 501c3 groups, not in the example that you're asking about, busing somebody from, Illinois into Michigan to vote or whatever, something like that, which would be flagrantly illegal. To me, the greater scandal is the way that the left uses 501c3 foundations' money, going to 501c3 public charity activist groups to register and to register voters and to do get out the vote. Let's hope at least at their legal polling places, because I know that the left isn't doing that on a nonpartisan basis, which is the only supposed legal justification for it, leaving aside the question of whether whether there's any improper polling place use of that. I think that that's a scandal, and that the IRS and Congress ought to shut down things like that. And I'd be happy to if you give me your email, I'll be quite happy to send you one of my favorite things from the Soros leaks, which is a memo. It mentions Matthew Vadum actually in the memo. It's a memo from 2011, so it's the beginning of the 2012 cycle, and it is from Andrew Stern, then the head of the SEIU, arguably the most politically powerful union. NEA could fight for that title, maybe, but and Andy Stern at that time was the most frequent outside visitor to the West Wing of Barack Obama, and he and Deepak Bhargava of Color of Change, community organizer, the two of them are writing this memo to George Soros himself and to the other members of the U.S. Programs Board for the Soros Foundations. And the memo has 3 points. It says itself, there's 3 points here. The first point is nothing matters except winning the next election. It's an interesting thing for a foundation to be concerned about, but because of course that would be illegal if that were their true purpose. But that all I know is what Andrew Stern tells me. That the first point is we absolutely have to win the next election. Nothing else matters. The second point is unless you put millions and millions of dollars of foundation money into 501c3 activist groups on the left to register and get out the voters, we will not succeed in point 1, winning the election. And by the way, don't worry, the Ford Foundation has also pledged millions of dollars, as have some other left-wing foundations, for this registration and get out the vote work. And then the last point is we know that you get so tired every election cycle having to put millions of dollars into registration and get out the vote. But we have a fix for that in the long run, electoral reform, quote unquote. And what they mean by that is having groups like the Brennan Center, a grantee of theirs, and other grantees fight all voter ID laws and anything else designed to keep elections honest. Having universal registration of all persons with a heartbeat, having weeks and weeks and weeks of voting ahead of time, making absentee voting easier, et cetera, et cetera. The whole left-wing anti-voter integrity agenda.
It used to be that reporters would, back in the days before you were pressured not to do this, they would cover vote fraud. I remember Nightline going down to Alabama and following a truck along, and the truck would deliver checks from the government to various houses, and when a check would be delivered, they had a little team, and the team would go up, take the check from the mailbox that would be like next to the door often of the house. They'd knock on the door, the little lady would come out, they'd say, oh, we have your check here from the government. Oh, and we have your absentee ballot to fill out right now in front of us. And they would do it, and they got caught. And there were places where there were more absentee ballots in elections than there were people. So, and this was, Jeff Sessions got in trouble. They still call him a racist because he exposed some African Americans who were stealing votes from other African Americans. No, he was never a Democrat. At least not in the 35 years that I've known him. In any event, when I was the first story I ever had, the first scoop I ever had, I should say, was I went to a polling place, and they had been voting illegally there for so long that they just did this right in front of me, which was if you come up, you go into the booth, and as you're going to the booth, they hand you a marked sample ballot, not an unmarked sample ballot, but a marked sample ballot, in other words, telling you how to vote. And if you took too long in the booth, indicating that you were not going by the marked sample ballot, they would stick their heads in and go, hey, Sam, you need any help in there? And then they would go in the booth with people. No, when I would go to political conventions, I've been to 10 Republican or Democrat conventions, we'd hang out in what used to be called the Railroad Lounge, which was the reporters' hangout. And we'd stay up till 2 o'clock in the morning telling stories about vote fraud. No matter what your political orientation was, everybody had these stories, and they were true stories. And now there's this thing that, oh my gosh, if you mention vote fraud and you suggest that maybe we ought to have voter ID, which we have for things like buying fingernail polish, but it's not important enough for voting to have voter ID. And they had, Nelson Mandela wanted voter ID. In Mexico and Canada, voter ID. But oh my gosh, it's somehow bad to do that because we don't have any fraud and we're not allowed to report on it. And that's the implication of what I mean, I would love to give you, I could give you literally hours of examples of things that either I witnessed or other reporters witnessed and told me credibly about it. The sheriff who dies in Louisiana, and they find in his attic all the ballot boxes that he had stolen, and he kept a lot of them like a serial killer keeping hair from people, things like that. These things happen. And
Can I
so,
ask a
anyway.
quick question, because my husband is waiting?
Yep.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I think you've had a turn. But I'm wondering, have you done any research on the SCAFE Foundation, who actually supports both left-wing and right-wing causes? Because I've actually done some digging on them, and they do support immigration. I think they were the funding behind FAIR. They are the funding behind CIS, some of the other immigration groups. But they give also to a lot of environmental groups, and they also give to Planned Parenthood. And I've actually dug and found where they are sponsoring programs for sterilization of populations in places like Africa and China and Central and South America. I'm sorry. Have you ever dug into any of that? It's like SCAFE Mellon.
Forthcoming in one of our next couple months magazines, which will be serialized on capitalresearch.org.
Yeah.
I actually had a piece on the immigration policy debate and the organizations behind it, and that includes, I'm not sure which of the Scaife Mellon philanthropies. I'm afraid I do not.
FAIR is one.
The
CIS
Fair,
is another one.
means the donor side,
Fair
because
CIS,
there are multiple
Fair CIS,
donor
Numbers
sides.
USA, Education
Yes.
Fund.
Yeah. But a lot of that was actually born
They have
out of the SCAFE Foundation.
out of
yeah.
some of the Scaife Mellon philanthropies.
Yes.
It's one particular one whose name escapes me at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. That happens to me all the time.
And we actually have a report on this forthcoming from our.
But did you come across what I'm talking? There was a program.
Yeah, no, they
where there's actually
they.
She unfortunately
I am,
she had a very eugenics mentality, and so
yeah,
she
one of the
Yeah.
Scaifes was a big fan of Margaret Sanger, the founder
Yeah.
of Planned Parenthood,
So it was-
notorious eugenicist.
Is it Cordelia Scaife? Cordelia Mellon Scaife, I think was her name.
I cannot
It's
vouch.
one of the past generations.
From
Yeah.
from Pennsylvania.
From
they're
Pennsylvania,
Pittsburghers.
yes,
But
Pittsburgh.
she's also sponsoring anti-fracking protesters too.
I believe that is the case.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, well, now you may now be talking about the forward generation,
Okay,
because
yeah,
there's
I'm probably holding
there,
it
there
too,
were
but-
at least 4 different major
But see, when
philanthropies
I was doing some
funded
digging
by
on the
SCAFE money.
SCAFE Foundation, I also found that they were sponsoring sterilization programs
They're
in
one of the
non-white countries, and that I found very disturbing.
that I cannot vouch for that. What I can vouch for is that the Scaife philanthropy I am thinking of gave $100,000 to Planned Parenthood of Western Pennsylvania.
No, I know that they support Planned Parenthood, but this was a program that was actually out of Planned Parenthood, and the person who's ahead of the program was actually former Planned Parenthood, and they are actually going in and I'm not sure how aware the women they are experimenting with a sterilization drug.
I'm afraid I'm
and-
not.
I'm not trying to control a
I'm
rabbit
not
hole. I'm
familiar
just
with
saying
that.
I had come across that years ago, and I'm just wondering if that's still going on or if you ever came across that.
Yeah. Well, the population control programs are very popular across the political spectrum
Yeah.
with many large foundations.
Because of the Tannen, the John Tannen
Hewlett
connection.
is Hewlett,
Yeah.
Gates,
Tannen. John
Buffett.
Yeah.
Very popular across the thing.
Yeah.
Well,
We had a very good paper by Mrs. Mancini, the head of the March for Life, about 2 or 3 years ago. It's on our website about Planned Parenthood and taking a
the
critical
variety of
view at
sponsors
it.
behind
Yeah,
it. Yep.
my thing was actually going after, looking at SCAFE.
I know.
And seeing,
I'm,
Yep.
watching there was anti-immigration and pro-Planned Parenthood.
Yeah,
and
there-
it was
there
basically
is-
for population control.
Yeah,
So-
there is one of the Scaife Mellon philanthropies whose name
So which is
shame on me
eugenics,
escapes me
which I find eugenics kind of concerning, so.
entirely understandably.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm sorry.
Well,
No,
and,
it's
and,
okay.
and I apologize, but they are going to throw us out of our room here in just a second. But we are very grateful for everybody's participation. We're happy to talk to folks afterwards Thank you so much. I hope every Thursday you will check out the InfluenceWatch podcast. Thanks so much.